Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the NOAA Library seminar. It's all connected, unraveling the mystery of how PIDs work and connect to support research. I'm going to say hi to everyone. I'm Katie Poser, the Outreach Librarian, and I will be the technical side today. And Jennifer Fagan-Fry, who is our NOAA Institutional Repository and Publishing Coordinator, will be giving our presentation today. So, Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can share your slides.
All right. Thanks, Katie. Once I share my slides, I am going to turn my camera off just because Katie informed me you may not be able to see my entire slide if you look at me. So with that, just quick check with Katie. Everything's showing up okay?
Everything looks good. Free to go.
Fantastic. So we will dive in. Thanks everyone for joining us. Today, we are going to talk about persistent identifiers, specifically how they are all connected. What we're hoping to do today is sort of unravel some of the mysteries around, why we talk about PIDs so much, how they work, and how they connect to one another, and how all of this kind of supports the research that we do within NOAA and the greater scientific community. So, uh, what are we doing here today? We have a case. We have named him lovingly in the library Detective Dan. And what we are looking at today is how do all these different types of persistent identifiers work together, and how do they help us and enable us to better understand the full research life cycle from soup to nuts. How do we get from point A to point B, and how can PIDs help us not only manage our research but also track that research? So we kind of have the who, where, how, and what of our research, right? So, who is doing or did the research? Who did you collaborate with when you were doing said research? Where did your funding for that research come from? And where are you, as the researcher, affiliated? How were you funded? How were you supported if you weren't directly funded through a grant or an award? And what did you collect? What data did you collect? What specimens, those sorts of things. What did you author? Did you author anything at all? Did you develop any code or a software program, any sort of algorithm, a model? Was there a patent involved? I don't have it here on the slide, but maybe a patent was developed as part of this research. So it's sort of the what aspect. So each of these is tied to a persistent identifier, each of those four sorts of elements. So, what exactly, and I'm sure for a bunch of you this is some refresher, but bear with me just in case, what exactly is a persistent identifier? So, a persistent identifier is a unique, persistent, machine resolvable, and processable identifier. We use them for disambiguating and identifying different entities across multiple platforms throughout the research and development lifecycle. And every persistent identifier has an associated metadata schema. What does that mean? There is a structured set of metadata that underlies each persistent identifier that has related information about that item that persistent identifier is referencing. So, what persistent identifiers are not. And I know I say this a lot, and I just want to reiterate it because there's a lot of misconceptions around a PID and how they work and how they function. It's not just some randomly assigned number. They are expressed as a full URL. Sometimes those URLs will contain some semantic information, something along the lines of if you're looking at a DOI for a journal article, sometimes you can see sort of the abbreviation for the journal in that DOI, but not always. Sometimes it is just a sort of string of alphanumeric numbers, but it is still part of a URL. Every PID must point to something. Typically, we're pointing to a landing page. It is sometimes you'll see it'll point directly to a PDF or to a document. Full disclosure, that's not a best practice. It's usually best for a DOI or some sort of persistent identifier to point to a landing page, but there are instances where pointing directly to a document is necessary. And the metadata itself that underlies everything, that metadata schema and all the information in it must be maintained long term. forever and ever. PIDs are not transferable. So once you have a persistent identifier assigned to something, that's it. That's that item's persistent identifier. I can't take that, say, DOI for a publication and move it to a different publication because that particular DOI is supposed to reference that particular item, hence persistent in the name of it. So if we have, say, a tech memo and you publish that tech memo with the repository, but then 2 years later you have a new version of that tech memo, we can't just reuse that same DOI. We're going to have to issue a new DOI because it's a new version. So new versions equal a new persistent identifier. What we can do in that underlying metadata schema is link those two items together so you can see one supersedes the other, but we cannot reuse a DOI. And I know I have said this 100 times, and I will say it 150,000 more, that a persistent identifier, a PID, is a promise to the user. And that promise is that they will always be able to find and access that particular element that they are looking for, or find information about that particular person, or reference that specific organization, or find that data set. It is a promise to the user, and we don't want to break that promise. So there's three main types of identifiers. Again, we've gone over this. This is a lot of rehashing, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So we have persistent identifiers for outputs, so publications, datasets, software, code. Typically, these are DOIs. I'm pretty certain everyone's familiar with the DOI and what it looks like. And these are managed through things like DataCite and Crossref. We have people, used to disambiguate researchers. So there is another Jennifer Fagan-Fry, believe it or not, and we both work in not super similar fields, but we have been known to work in similar fields. So we use ORCIDs to differentiate between her and myself. I think everyone here is pretty familiar with ORCIDs. And then we have organizational identifiers. So this is used to disambiguate and identify specifically funders, employers, and research organizations. Right. So there is a National Weather Service for us, but there's also the Chinese National Weather Service, and both sometimes go by just National Weather Service. How do I know which one we're talking about? Obviously, you can look at context, but isn't it easier just to have a persistent identifier saying I'm referring to this one or that one? The most common organizational identifier, and the one we're going to talk about today, is ROAR, which I'm hoping everyone is a little more familiar with. ROAR at this point as well. So there's something missing from that, right? When we were looking at the who, where, how, and what, and that's the how, and that's the funding piece. So we talk about the main three types of category, or the three categories for PEDs. Funding is missing from that. So the ability to track funding sources is really difficult for us, mostly because it's inconsistent. Funding is acknowledged inconsistently by authors across the board. There's a lot of haphazard practices for even assigning funding informations, or excuse me, assigning funding. I'm going to call them identifiers, but like they don't quite fit into the true definition of what a persistent identifier is. And some of those identifiers that funding entities use are not actually unique. If you look at an NIH funding identifier, it's just a number. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, that's not unique at all. Um, even NOAA feigns the funding number that NOAA uses. While they're more unique than what NIH uses, in theory, they're not globally unique, which is a key element, right? And so when there's inconsistent practices on how entities provide funding information, it's going to lead to inconsistencies with how grantees are acknowledging that funding information. The thing that we see regularly in publications is this research was supported by NOAA, which is great, that they acknowledge they got the money from NOAA, but what part of NOAA? Did that come from OAR? Did it come from fisheries? Did it come from Weather Service? Did it come from all three of those? I don't know. And that makes it hard for us to know exactly, for us to be accountable for where we are sending money out and what is being produced by that. So, utilizing PIDs, specifically DOIs, could help by providing that sort of unique, resolvable link to the funding, which removes those sort of haphazard practices, and it offers a known sort of format for citing information. At this point, I'd like to think pretty much all researchers know when you have a DOI, that's how you cite something. You include the DOI in the citation. Using a DOI for funding wouldn't be any different. I have this funding, I just say my funding came from here, and you would cite that DOI. So let's talk about this a little bit more, right? Let's talk about grant and award PIDs and how we would use DOIs to do this, right? So I talked a little bit about metadata schemas before. This is a very basic and low level sort of description of what kind of metadata a DOI for a grant. So we would have the funding entity. For us, let's just say OAR. We'll use CPO as a good example, the Climate Program Office. In the metadata, the funding entity would be OAR CPO. The principal investigator, that's who we're giving said money to, the PI for that particular grant, and their home institution. So where they're, if CPO is giving money to someone at University of Colorado, right, we would have that investigator's name and University of Colorado in that metadata. And I want to highlight here, I've made a note with my little exclamation point that those are elements that have persistent identifiers that we would be linking within the metadata here, right? So other elements in the metadata are the type of funding. Was it a grant? Was it via a NOFO? Was it a contract? What type of funding was awarded to this person? You can include the amount, the dollar amount. The You include the entity assigning the DOI, so that is NOAA, that would be assigning the DOI for it. The award year, if there's a range, right, for like cooperative institutes, it's a 5 or 10 year sort of range, that would be included. Any other funding identifier. So I'd like to think a lot of you are familiar with FundRef. That would be an additional funding identifier that we could put in there. A description or abstract of the project, the grant that is being issued, and then any related identifiers. So, what we mean by related identifiers is, are there any known publications that have come from it or known data sets? All of that can be added in there as well. So, Detective Dan is setting up his, as we call it lovingly in the library, murder boards. We are going to solve this by connecting all of these pieces. So we have our grants, and we're going to assign a DOI to our grant. Next piece. Because we are giving a grant to a person, we need to deal with personal PIDs. So specifically, orchids. Orchids are the most common. They are not the only ones out there. There are things like researcher ID, there is a Scopus ID. Orchids are the most common. They are the most integrated per NSPM 33. They are the only ones that sort of meet the definition here. So we're going to focus on orchids. The information within ORCID metadata is as we have listed here, right? The researcher name, your preferred, your first, last, any preferred names, honorifics, those sorts of things. You have to have an email. You should have two emails. You should have your work email and you should have a personal email so that you can always ensure you have access, especially if you move institutions. If you only use your NOAA email address and you move to a different you move to a university, you may lose access to your ORCID because you don't have that backup email. So always put in two emails with your ORCID. Any additional author identifiers. So, like I said, if you have a researcher ID, a Google Scholar ID, you will have linkage. There's a link to your institution, your employer, current and historical. And again, these are tied to RORs, which we'll get into in a second. Your education, again, that's an institution, which will have a ROR associated with it. Any of your professional activities. So if you're a member of any societies, you can include that in your ORCID. Your works and or outputs, so your publications, your data sets, you can put in your code, you can put in patents. All of that with the associated persistent identifier for those things is included in your ORCID. Funding. If you receive a grant from any institution, you can put that into your ORCID. It is really helpful, and it's a nice way for you to track what you have done and where you have received funds. And you can also include peer review activities. There's a caveat to this. Any peer review activities that you do would have to be added by the entity you are doing that peer review for. So, hypothetically, let's say NOAA has a journal and you do peer review for this journal. NOAA would be able to push to your ORCID profile that you did peer review for this particular special edition of something. So, all of that can be included in your ORCID. So, we have a couple elements where there are other PIDs that could be connected within your ORCID. Specifically, I mentioned funding. So we already had funding on our murder board. That DOI can go into your ORCID. But remember, part of the funding DOI, the grant DOI, was that we would include the PI information. And so that ORCID information for the PI is also included in the DOI for the grant. So now we have one connection back and forth between these two things. So next comes organizations, and I said we were going to talk about this. So ROARs specifically. ROARs contain essentially just the official organization name, any alternate names or aliases. So when you look at NOAA as a whole, the official name for NOAA is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, right? But in the metadata for the ROAR, we also include NOAA, Department of Commerce, NOAA, so on and so forth, right? You include the type of organization. So obviously we are a government entity. The location, that's always going to be the headquarters that's included. So technically for NOAA's, it's Washington, D.C., website, and then any other identifiers. So there are other types of organizational PIDs. They are not as widely used as ROAR, but you can include those into the ROAR metadata. ROARs are linked across a number of systems and are integral to those connections, right? So specifically ORCID, but also DataCite and Crossref, which is affiliated with FundRef, also use ROARs in order to link an organization. So you'll notice here that I don't have any special indications of other PIDs. Because ROAR is just focusing on the organization itself, it doesn't necessarily in the metadata include other persistent identifiers, right? So we have our funding institution at the top, and then we have just the academic institution that someone's affiliated with. And we have a ROAR for each of those. The ROAR for the funding institution goes into the DOI info for the grant. And then the ROAR for the uh, researchers affiliation, institutional affiliation goes into their ORCID identifier as well as the grant award information. So now we have even more connections, right? So now we get into outputs, publications, software, code, data, patents, right? I'm just going to focus on kind of the four big ones that we're most familiar with. And for outputs, we're talking about DOIs, right? So within the DOI metadata, we're going to include the title of the element, the item, whatever that output is, the authors, that's where we're going to include ORCIDs. The publisher, that's where we're going to include the publisher's ROAR. So if we're talking about like a tech memo and the Climate Program Office issued this tech memo, we will associate as the publisher using CPO's ROAR, right? The date that this thing was created or published, quote unquote, you can't see my air quotes, a description, an abstract, something like that. Funding sources for your funding. This is where we would include a DOI for your grant if it is a grantee based thing. Licensing information. So, especially for publications and data, but this applies to software and all sorts of outputs. How can people use and reuse this? Is this something licensed under a Creative Commons license? Is it in the public domain? That's the info we would be putting in there. Any other associated or related outputs. So, if we're talking about a DOI for a publication, is there a data set? DOI. We can include that info, or vice versa. If it's for a data set and there's an associated pub, we can include the DOI for that publication, so on and so forth. And then for us, because we do a lot of publishing of gray literature and series documents, any series information, there are a ton of other things that you can include in an output persistent identifier, a DOI. I, I'm not going to get into all of them here. These are the key elements, though. So now we have yet more areas where we can link things together. So back to Detective Dan and his murder ward. You can see here, it's a little bonkers now, and Dan's about to lose his mind. Right? So we have a DOI for our software, and we have a DOI for some code that we wrote, and we have a DOI for our initial data set, and we have a DOI for the publication. And so in the publication DOI, we are citing the software, the code, and the data all in that publication. But also in that publication, we're listing the author, all the author ORCIDs, so that we know who those authors are. Additionally, we would also be including RORs in that information, right? To acknowledge the affiliation of said authors. We would also be taking our grant DOI and acknowledging that in the DOI for all of those things that it funded: the software, the code, the data, the publication. In the publication, we're listing the grant, so on and so forth, right? So you see, all of these things are very interconnected, and this is messy. This looks real messy, right? But behind the scenes, it makes it easier for us to find everything. So what where do we stand, right, in our investigation here, right? We've figured out, we've identified some suspects, and we found clues about how all of these things link together, right? So now what we really need to think about is, like, why? What is the motivation behind all of this? Who specifically does this benefit, and who's responsible for all of this work? Who's responsible for what pieces of all of this work, right? So now we need to figure out the the who, what, where, why. So what is our motivation for doing all of this? For all of this work with all of these PIDs, why would we put in all of this effort? It's about um, the ilities, as we were calling them, as I created this slide, right? It's about discoverability. It's about citability, accountability, credibility, measurability, and then I couldn't come up with an ility for research impact, but I think you get the gist here, right? Using PIDs makes things more discoverable, which they also make things more citable, which in turn makes them, again, more discoverable. When we accurately cite things, we're being held accountable, and it improves our credibility, which makes things easier to measure so that we can have a full idea of what our research impact is, whether it's on an individual level, whether it's on a project or a program level, or whether it's at an agency level or an institutional level. All of that works together so we can really see what we're getting out of the money that we give out of the work that we do. So, who stands to benefit from all of this? Well, when we talk about funders, the benefit for them is they are better able to manage their awards and their funds. It's easier to track things. And it means for us as a government entity, we're being more transparent. We are being clear about who we are giving money to, what the expectations are, and that they are going to acknowledge that they've used said funding. For researchers, it's a matter of disambiguation. It makes sure that John Smith from NOAA is different than John Smith from NASA. Make sure you are getting proper attribution. Sorry, I flipped those around. But also, it's a way for you to link, as a researcher, for you to link all your outputs together, right? You can link together your publication and the underlying data. You can link together your code with the particular software package that you developed, so on and so forth. And then, kind of for the general public and or larger scientific community, again, it's back to discoverability and access to all the good research that we do and that we have funded. But also, it's about that transparency, letting people know who we're giving money to, how they're using it, and what became of all of that research. So, who's responsible? You are. We all are. But but there's a lot that everyone can do in this process, right? And so what I've done here is sort of listed out what you as researchers, program managers, so on and so forth can do. First and foremost, get an ORCID. If you don't have one already, please get an ORCID. Um, ensure that all of the outputs that you produce have DOIs. So when you submit a publication to a journal, obviously the journal is going to mint that DOI. But if you produce some sort of gray literature, a tech memo, a tech report, just a white paper, whatever it is, if you submit it to the library, we will assign a DOI for it. If you have a data set, archive your data set with NCEI. They will assign a DOI for it. Or if for whatever reason maybe NCEI doesn't or can't take that particular data set, put it in a different alternate sort of designated repository, something like maybe Zenodo, Dataverse, so on and so forth. There's a massive list of those that are available where they will assign a DOI for you. If you have received an award, a grant, whatever it may be, if there is a PID available with that, identify that, use that, share that. If you are a program manager who hands out grants or manages grants, make sure any PIs know what that award identifier is. Know your organization's ROAR or any affiliated ROARs. The library has a full list of these, and we are always happy to help folks with this. If your particular entity does not have a ROAR, you can contact us in the library and we can make sure that we get that established and set up. And finally, as researchers, as program managers, we need to make sure we're including all of this information in our publications, in our data sets, when we submit them to all of those different entities. Without including that information, it's hard for us to link it all together. And we wind up in the situation we're in now, where it's hard for us to track everything because it's not clearly stated. So, with that, I think Detective Dan has done his job to sort of lay out all the issues and all the problems and how all of this fits together to make things easier for us. So I will stop there and see if we have any questions. You'll have to forgive me, Katie. It's been a while since I remember how to get to the Q&A.
No worries. I have the Q&A up and ready. Thank you, Jen. And thank you for fitting it in our normal Wednesday training time period of a half hour. I don't see any questions yet, but I do have a question myself.
Yep.
Everyone has a lot of demands on their time currently.
Yeah.
So how can the library specifically help people uh, get all of this set up in without taking a ton of their time and without uh, requiring a lot of work and time put in later?
Absolutely. Great question. So within the library, we are an ORCID consortium member. And so we in the library can, with anyone's permission, manage their ORCID on their behalf. So what you would do is give us permission through our ORCID form. You can give us permission to manage your ORCID. That means we would manage your affiliations long term. And being clear with this, long term, we would be able to push any of your publications to your ORCID profile so that you wouldn't have to keep that updated. It also gives us the ability to use your information that you have in your ORCID so we could pull and harvest that info ourselves. So say in Katie, you wrote an article and you have some data and everything that's listed on your ORCID. I have the article, but I didn't know you had that data. I didn't know about that data set because you did not properly cite it in your publication. Shame on you. But because I'm able to manage your ORCID profile, I can see that linkage. And now within your publication DOI, I can take dataset DOI and include it in your publication DOI as a related identifier and vice versa. And then within the repository, I can make sure that that dataset DOI is also linked so that if someone stumbles onto it via the repository, they can also get to the underlying data. So there's a number of benefits that back and forth when we're able to manage someone's ORCID profile. You as a researcher will always have the ability to grant that access. And at any point in time, if you get angry with me, if I get your coffee order wrong, whatever it may be, you can revoke that access. So the researcher still always has ultimate control over their profile, but we are able to sort of do some of the dirty work for you so that it's one less thing that you have to manage and think about. As long as you know what your orchid is and you're including it on your publications and you give us permission to manage it, we can help you with the rest of that process. The other thing I want to point out that I want folks to remember is when it comes to DOIs for outputs, the publishing entity is the one responsible for minting that DOI. So again, for publications, it's the journal or publisher. If you submit something to Wiley or PLOS, they will mint that DOI. If you submit something to me at the repository, I will mint that DOI. I am taking on that responsibility because we are serving as the publisher in that instance. Same thing goes for software code. If you put something into, say, Zenodo will mint a DOI for you, so they take on that responsibility.
Thank you. That was exactly the answer I was looking for. Let's see what questions we have. Great, we do have a question, and I'm gonna switch up our screen so we're all seeing both of us, and I'm gonna bring it up and show it. Here we go. So, as a retired NCEI federal employee, my research now is self-sponsored. This has caused me not have an organizational affiliation in my ORCID record. And then, for example, ResearchGate. What do you recommend in such a case?
It's a great question. So within ORCID, you have the ability to indicate that something was a previous affiliation. You can put, start and end dates. So at least you would have your previous affiliations. When it comes to being a retired researcher or sort of independent, however you want to phrase it, there is an option within ORCID to include something along those lines. You'll have to forgive me, I don't remember the exact language that they use for that, but there is an option within ORCID to sort of call that out. The other thing that I always suggest folks, especially if you are a retired the federal employee or have moved on to another institution, is under the Scientific Integrity Committee released a best practices document related to authorship, and in there is a couple sections on retired employees, people who have separated, so on and so forth, how to address affiliation in those instances. So I always recommend folks take a look at that too. Between those two options, you should be able to make it clear that you used to work here, but now you're, independent. It's a great question.
It's a good one. Okay, so our next question is, has there been work done on the problem of PIDs for forever changing longitudinal data sets, like fisheries observer data that don't have an endpoint and aren't snapshotted at the point in time to create a distinct entity?
Yeah, so we're moving a bit into the area of I don't handle data set DOIs. However, I'm somewhat familiar with them. So it's a this is a tricky question to sort of answer. Um, but I'll say this. When it comes to sort of continually updated data sets, right? It's tricky. There becomes questions of granularity and um, how to manage that. When you're doing research and working with that sort of data, there are options and there are instances where creating sort of a subset of that data may be necessary. And in that instance, depending on policy, depending on where you deposit and or archive that data, they may issue a separate DOI for it. Oftentimes, there may be a collection level, as we call them, sort of DOI record that would sit at the top of that. And then you would just have to indicate sort of the parameters of when, where, how, whatever you used for that particular publication or that project. So there it's a tricky situation when you have continuously updated things. The same thing happens with publications, although publications are a bit easier in terms of you do sort of have a finite discrete thing that comes from it that's a little easier to pinpoint. But I think there's other examples of satellite data that comes down, and those are just issued at a very high level. So to my knowledge, and again, I don't want to speak for NCEI, who manages and mints all the DOIs, but to my knowledge, they tend to leave things at a collection level and then sort of within publications and acknowledging what data you have used to try to provide parameters of how or what portion of that overarching data you were using. It's not the best answer, but
No, that was good. Also, I wanted to confirm the scientific integrity policy that you were mentioning is just the policy itself, the one that was updated in 2024, correct? Or is it a separate?
there's a separate documentation that should be available via the Scientific Integrity Commons.
Got
It's
it.
called Best Practices for Designating Authorship. It's something that also, Katie, when you post this, we could put a link
Hmm.
to. I will
Hmm.
say that it is currently under review. There was a few edits that needed to be made. It will also be a part of our upcoming, soon to be released, hopefully, publications kind of handbook that includes like the
Hmm.
FRC policy and administrative publication policy and a number of other things like info and disclaimers and copyright and licensing and style guides, that sort of stuff. So it will be included
Hmm.
in there as well.
Got it. Okay, we've got so many good questions coming in, so I'm
Great.
gonna pop this one up on this screen. Here we go. Will all PIDs that NOAA curates be, I'm assuming, be maintained into perpetuity? For example, for the World Data Services and their included data sets that have DOIs.
So the intent of all PIDs is it is forever and always. So again, that goes back to my statement that I scream about. DOI is a promise forever and always until the end of time. So there are mechanisms in place. Let's say the worst case scenario, for whatever reason, the library and NCEI go away. What we would do prior to that is we would work with DataSite, where we mint our DOIs in the scientific community, to find someone to manage those data sets long term for us, to manage those PIDs for us long term. So if we needed to move publications from one place to another, that would impact the DOI, right? So if let's say I take a document out of the repository where the DOI points and I put it on a different website. Part of my responsibility long term is to make sure that the DOI points to that new spot. So I need to go in and update the metadata. So if something happens to me, the library, when I say me, not me personally, but the library or NCEI, right? Prior to that happening, we would work with someone so that they would then be in charge of maintaining that. It is a process, but DataSite helps us facilitate that. So that has happened. We have taken over DOIs for other entities as well. So it is something that does happen. The intent is for those things to always be managed long term.
Awesome. Okay, our next question is a little long. I work for a NOAA program that's working to track outputs associated with our grant awards. In a few cases, our grants weren't acknowledged as the funding source in the publication. Is there anything we can do since they've been published?
So it's a bit tricky. If the item is something that is in the institutional repository or should be in the institutional repository, we are happy to work with folks to include that grant information in our metadata so that it at least is acknowledged there within the repository and we can link those things together. Um, in theory, it's difficult to enforce, but you could have the grantee go back to the publisher and ask them to do some sort of addendum, something like that, to include that information. Publishers may or may not agree to do it. Some of them will, some of them won't. It is technically up to the publishers because it has been published at that point in time. It is also probably difficult to enforce that on your grantees and PIs, but it is always worth asking if they are willing to edit that. If it is something that is NOAA published, and again, in the repository, we have more control over that. And we in the library are happy to help with that. So there's a couple ways to do it, but it's a lot of if a publisher is willing to edit or update or add some sort of notice to a publication, then you can ask them to do that.
Also, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, on the front end, we can help with making sure the award language includes something that says you have to acknowledge funding in your publications, correct? We can help with that.
Yes. So I'll say this as part of the upcoming PAR NAO and implementation, we are actively, myself as a co-chair of that group, and my fellow co-chair and the rest of our colleagues in the working group are working currently, right now, actually, on language that would go out in all NOFOs and terms and conditions, so on and so forth, all that grant language that would be really clear about the expectations, what people should be and how they should be citing things, and also give us a little bit more in terms of teeth to enforce that. I know it's really difficult to enforce. So we plan to have some guidance and documentation for folks on the expectations as well as examples of what we would exactly want to see from folks. So hopefully in theory, the goals within the next probably 2 to 3 months, we would have some of that guidance available.
Ooh, awesome. Okay, a few more questions. But what about early career scientists who might be looking for advice on this?
I don't think there's no harm in having both. I Orchid's sort of the main guy, so if you have Orchid, like you're pretty good. That being said, I don't think that there's a real benefit to having one over the other. There isn't necessarily a benefit to anybody to have both, but you can. Again, it doesn't hurt, but it does mean more management. Orchid will pull in, so like, let's say you have a researcher ID already. If you establish an Orchid, they actually have a connection where they'll pull in that info from researcher ID for you, and vice versa. So you can link those two things together. So there isn't necessarily a benefit to having both. I do think sorry, you'll have to forgive me. I got um, um, the early career researchers. I'm sorry. Sorry.
It's okay.
Um, right. So for early career scientists, I think the key thing is if you have an orchid, just use it as much as possible. Let us help you manage it. Um, I, Also, I didn't say this before. If we're managing it for you, you still have full control of that. You can still add things and take things down. And if we put something up and you don't like that, you can revoke that. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier.
We did have a follow-up question on that. If you want the library to manage your ORCID, do they need to turn off the two-factor
No,
authentication?
no,
Ah,
no. No, because how we manage that goes about it's separate. What would happen in those instances is we become a trusted organization. You say that we have the same permissions you do, and to some extent. And no, so you wouldn't have to edit or do anything to your personal authentication because we're not actually signing into your orchid. We're just pushing information and editing information in your orchid, which again, that goes to my point I just made. In theory, if I change something or Chris changes something in your profile, you can reject that and take it back and pull it back.
perfect. Okay, and I
Excuse me.
think this is getting back to what you were mentioning about a best practices. Um, the organizational guideline document that is from the NOAA's Scientific Integrity Community. And I'm not finding it on the Scientific Integrity Commons
Mm.
right now, but I did put the Commons link in the chat. Um, so I hope either Jen, if you have, we can follow up and make sure that gets in the
Yeah.
email.
Yep.
Okay,
We'll
let's
follow up and put it in the email. Like I said, I do
Mhm,
know that there were some edits being made, and they might have had to pull it back while those edits were made, and then it'll be posted. But
mhm,
it will be on that Scientific Integrity Commons site. Um,
mhm.
but yeah, we can make sure that there's something that'll go out in the email that'll get folks access to that info.
Yeah, and there is a question that says, "Are they going to get a link to this presentation?" Yes, you are. You're going to get a follow-up email that has this full recording with the Q&A included and applicable links. So that will go out a little bit after this wraps up. So our last question that I'm seeing right now, unless someone's furiously typing, is back to an area that I know Jen doesn't feel as much comfortability with. But do you have examples for data set DOIs?
Not off the top of my head. Not prepared. Sorry, I should have thought about that. We can get some. NCEI manages all of our data, so there's plenty. Um, but we can pull some of those and share those within the email out to folks too. A link to a handful of those, so we can give an example of a publication and a data set DOI, just so folks can sort of see it. What I'm thinking, what we can do that may be useful to folks is we will not link to the DOI itself, but we will link to the data site record so folks can sort of see more of
Mm-hmm.
a back end kind of piece of what it looks like on the back end.
Hmm. I think that will be helpful.
So hopefully that'll be helpful for folks just to get a better picture of how it's all connected.
Yes. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think do we can do our wrap up here and thank everyone for joining us. You will get that email. Might take a minute so we can gather all these pieces so you have a full picture. Um, and I want to reiterate that the library is here to help you with this. It sounded a little overwhelming. We had a whole murder board. We were like, everything is connected and you're responsible, but we're also responsible and we want to help you in that process. So, Jen, any last words before we end?
No, just thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And we will hunt down that. Best practices if we can.
Mhm.
And if we can't, we'll provide you as much information about it and when it may be available to you. So, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Join us next week. We have Wednesday trainings every Wednesday at noon. Next week, we're going to be talking about Section 508. It's just a half hour non recorded event. So, thank you for joining this special one during Persistent Identifier Week. Take care.